Consider the travel postcard. It's a great way to tell people that you're thinking about them while you're on your travels, show some of the sights that you're seeing, and it's also really cheap. In a way, they're the Instagram of the past without all the duck lips, sending images of noteworthy and sometimes not so noteworthy places all around the world. The messages on the back become a sneak peek into the sender's life. Sometimes they're intriguing stories of heartbreak and joy, monumental events, or sometimes just mundane updates. Today, I'm pleased to share with you a conversation I recently had with Kenneth Weiss of the Midrust Postcard Project. He collects vintage postcards, finds the location present day and snaps a photo, and then digs into the story on the back to give some context to the story and the sender's life. He posts a card a day on his Instagram feed and also has been turning some of these postcards into short stories that he also hosts on his website. It's a great conversation about vintage postcards, travel, and storytelling. I hope you'll enjoy the following conversation with Kenneth Weiss of the Midrust Postcard Project.
Well, welcome. My name is Chris Magnuson. I'm at Street View Vagabond, and I'm here with a very special guest. I'm going to be interviewing Kenneth Weiss today about his really intriguing project that deals with postcards and telling stories that you're finding about the history, about people's lives, and really about what I like to call almost like the Instagram of the past. So I'm so pleased to have Kenneth here with me. Kenneth is a published author, a professor, public speaker, and a digital marketer. But these all consistently draw from his core expertise, which is storytelling. He got to start writing labels for automotive chemical companies, such as "In case of swallowing, do not induce vomiting," and has evolved into writing Friends with features and benefits about marketing, and Slightware, the next great threat to brands for branding professionals. Lately, he's made the jump to fiction writing with a number of novels and short stories under development. But today, we are getting together to talk about a unique project that involves digging into the stories of the past that are found on vintage postcards. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining today. It's so great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Awesome. And I've got your photo up here from your website, Kenneth J. Weiss. Stories are everywhere. And you've been finding stories in a very unique place. Why don't you tell us real quickly, it's like, where are you finding these stories?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I got interested in postcards. And kind of after COVID hit, I started diving into them a little bit more. And I realized within every postcard, there's really the opportunity for so many different stories. So there's who sent it, who was the recipient, what they were talking about, the town that it was sent from, which is often different than what is shown on the postcard, the date of the postmark, and then everything that kind of happens in that swirl. So when I look at a postcard, I never really go into it with a preconceived notion of what the story is going to be. I really look at each individual postcard from every one of those angles and see what pops up. And some of it's just amazing.
All right, well, let's pop one up right here and let's see what this looks like here. So you're posting these on Instagram.
Yep.
And we've got one up here on the screen. It looks like a pretty nondescript neighborhood. With a quote underneath it. "I thought every day I would send you a card." Tell us a little bit about how you craft these postings and maybe a little bit about this story. What's going on in this postcard?
Yeah, so one of the kind of the fun things is in each post, I do a then and now view. So if you would find this on Instagram, you would see this postcard, and then underneath it, you would see what that place looks like now. And that's one of the stories in and of itself, is how all these different places change over time. The divided back postcard, as we know it, started in 1906, 1907, in that range. So that's where we started to see the postcards with the full picture on the front, and then the address and the inscription on the back. So, you're going from, 1900s all the way up until now, and a tremendous amount of things have changed, right? In this particular one, the street has changed a lot in terms of the number of trees and where the trees are. And if you would stand in that exact spot today, you would not be able to see that church steeple in the background, right? So you end up looking at houses, and you look at roof lines and gables. And this is a really fascinating one, because if you look at that house on the far right of the postcard, it's got such an interesting kind of gable with all the windows there. So that's an easy one to pick out. And you can see, what houses have remained, what houses have been changed. I do a lot, it used to be that these little towns had these great main streets, right, with these really elegant houses. But then literally over the century, it's been a gas station, it's been a bakery, it's been a shopping plaza, and one by one, all these little houses are picked off. This is a great example. If you would see that today, the majority of the houses are still there. So it's kind of a great little story of endurance within this small town, but they don't always turn out like that. And sometimes you find that one house that's still standing and it's the third or the fourth one down in the row on the postcard, and everything else has changed. But this is a great little story of perseverance.
Well, yeah, that's great. It sounds like this combination of kind of dipping into this moment in time. You have April 24th, 1919, getting a little bit of sense of like
Yeah.
who wrote this story, and then checking out like what's this place look like. Do you actually go to all of these places and stand
Yeah,
and take the modern day photos?
as many as possible. It's great fun to go there and take the pictures. Other times, I see what I can find online.
Yeah, great. So you get to travel too. Are you sending postcards home when you do this?
We sent postcards actually a little bit ago, a few weeks ago. It was National Postcard Day.
Okay.
So my wife and I, we have one daughter still at home. We've got other daughters scattered across the country. So we actually were in an antique shop and we found postcards that were original and blank from the cities that they either live in or have lived in. So we sent our kids postcards on Postcard Day from places that they lived. So it's kind of neat. You open up the mail and you get a vintage retro postcard, but it's got today's stamp on it and the inscription from today.
That is really cool. I bet they enjoy that.
Yeah.
So we've got this project is part of a large project. You've got a big milestone coming up next week. It's 400 postings, right? So
Yeah.
this is your 400 postcard is coming up. And it's part of your Midrust project. So tell us a little bit about the name of this and how this kind of got started.
Yeah, so there's this area of the country that I focus on is really kind of from the center of Pennsylvania all the way over to Iowa, then as far north as Michigan, and then down south through just West Virginia, Kentucky, and a little bit of Tennessee. And what I found in starting to do the research originally is there are these wonderful places that are a little bit Midwest and they are a little bit Rust Belt, right? And I say these are the places that you can see a red brick building on Main Street, and then in a 10-minute drive you're looking at a red barn that's 100 years old, right? So the Midrust is kind of that area of the country. And I think a lot of times people, and this is really kind of the ethos of the project, if you will, people assume that they've read about these places and they've heard the stories, and they don't think there's anything new and original there in kind of that section of the country, right? Some people feel that that part of the country, it's better times have passed. And I think the reality is the stories are so much more than people ever realized that happened in that part of the country. And that's really the spirit that informs this project, as well as the fiction that I write, is that there are some just endlessly fascinating people and stories and events and buildings and things that took place in this part of the country that most people don't realize. So I'm really kind of on a mission to uncover and recover that history, and then and try to bring the history back to people. One of the things, it was really exciting. Just a couple days ago, I was doing research on a postcard, and the postcard was sent over 100 years ago to a woman whose name was Autumn Jones, right? Kind of the Autumn is a little specific, the Jones is a little bit vague, but I was able to put together her story and why she got the postcard and the events around the postcard. And then I started doing some digging, and I was actually able to find this woman's grandson, who is now in his 70s, and mailed the postcard back to him. And so I actually returned that postcard back to the family, and it was a little bit of an adventure. So you start to read burial records and you read obituaries, and it names this person is survived by this person, but a lot of times I'm reading an obituary that might have been written in the 60s or 70s, and when it says this person is survived by, you kind of need to hit the pause button and realize, well, gosh, that was 50 years ago.
Right.
There's no telling if that person's still around.
Yeah.
And so I found this one descendant's name, and I found some phone numbers, tried the phone numbers, and just as it happened, I found a gentleman with that name listed as a member of a volunteer fire department in the middle of Pennsylvania. So called the fire department, and some other fireman asked, and I said, hey, I'm trying to reach this gentleman. And he very gruffly said, well, just call him. And I said, well, I don't have his number. And he said, well, here's his number. So I called him and I said, this is going to come really out of the blue, but I think I've got your grandmother's postcard. And him and I talked for a while, and then I was able to send that family back the postcard. So that's kind of an interesting little wrinkle that, you know, as I get deeper and more into it, sometimes I feel like, you know what, these postcards deserve to return home. So I try to find the somebody in the family and send them back.
Wow. And that just adds another layer to the story, right?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it was interesting to, you know, read her name,
right,
and to see the dates where she was born and when she died and where she was buried. But then talk to somebody who had Sunday dinner with her, right? And he remembers being a little kid and seeing her work on the farm, right? And it goes from just being this kind of name on a postcard to this actual person. And, you know, that's, I think, one of the interesting things about the project is, you know, there's such an element of humanity that runs through all these postcards. These were real live people with, you know, joys in their lives and troubles in their lives. And, you know, through it all, they accomplished great things, and they went different places, and they had interesting journeys in and of themselves. And it's neat to kind of connect with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Quick question. Is that a Midrust? Did you coin that word?
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. Very cool. All right. This is trademarked copyrighted material. Or,
yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So you talked a little bit about the stories, and like they're people, like you just said, right? In terms of like, you know, the richness of their stories, and the good, the bad, the highs, the lows. And it seems, and you've been kind of teasing that out even further. You know, you're writing fictional stories based on these postcards and these lives that you're kind of dipping in and out of. So tell us a little bit about these, how you're turning these into books, and what's coming out.
Yeah, so there's 4 short stories that have been created so far. 2 of them are available on the website to download. They're free downloads. They're just PDFs. Anybody can go there and enjoy them. And these really started, I had a handful of postcards where, in doing the research, I literally hit a dead end. And there was something, and I won't spoil them, you have to go read them, but there was something so interesting in each one of the postcards. I was almost kind of mad that I couldn't track it down as to who these people were and what was going. So I said, you know what, if I can't find the story, I'm going to go create it. And so wrote 4 different stories. And as you read through them, there's some interesting kind of tangential connections between the 2, whether it's character or place, between all of them. And they're easy reads. They're, you know, 20, 30, 40 pages long a piece, so you don't have to commit to a novel. And but the part that the people who like the project and people who just like good fiction, they'll find is that in each instance, there's something on the postcard that's part of the kind of the critical mass of the story.
And or do you find yourself using information that you're learning from other postcards to kind of help, you know, fill out these stories as you're writing?
Absolutely. I think there's lots of kind of subtle mechanical things, the dialect people use, the words that they use, but then there's also kind of the spirit of adventure that they have. And, you know, there were a lot of instances, you know, as you read these postcards from the past, that, you know, people were at a spot in their life where they were interested or needed to take a risk or needed to jump, whether it was they needed to go find a job or they had to move for a job and they were separated from their family for a certain period of time. I come across a lot where people are caring for a relative. So, you know, these were people that, for whatever the reason, they had to step out of their norm or step out of their comfort zone and go do something different. And that kind of spirit and that independence and that and passion that people had to go and try something and be committed to something, that really, really helps from a character standpoint, understanding, what those people were willing to do at different times when they needed to do it. And I think more than anything, that really helps as you think through characters and you think through settings and you think how people would act and react in different situations. It's been a great learning experience just to read through so many postcards.
It's funny, like as you described that, it kind of came to my mind that there's a reason why people write in postcards, right? It's at an inflection point, like you said,
Yeah.
they're on a journey or they need to get a message across to somebody. These aren't necessarily kind of like the postings that people do today, in terms of on social media. Hey, this is what I had for lunch.
Right.
There's really an impetus for like, hey, I want to take the time to write this, share some information, and send it to somebody. I'm thinking about you, or
Yeah.
it's a big moment in my life.
Yeah. And if even in the small day-to-day moments, they didn't have obviously the internet and social media
Right.
and telephones, weren't even always prevalent, but they always had that need to connect and reach out and at least put somebody's mind at ease, even if it's a simple postcard saying, I arrived safely, right? And there's a lot of those, but it speaks to how often people traveled and even the distances that they traveled. And, back then it was, you jump on a train and you go 500 miles away, and it's not like today where you send a text and say, hey, I'm here, or you mark yourself safe on Facebook from some event. It's like that little penny stamp was a way of giving somebody back a peace of mind that, hey, I'm here, I'm okay, this is where you can reach me. I find a lot of wonderful postcards where people actually have found a picture of a small town and they'll circle the building and they'll say, I am living in this room, right? And it just gives somebody a picture back home of where they are staying. And you see some great ones that are marked up. It's like, I'm working at this store. Or I found some great ones where people traveled and said, this is where we parked the car. So they used it as a little shorthand and made the doodle on it, and then did the inscription and address on the back.
Those are the original taggings of photos, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the postcards too, because one of the things as I'm reviewing your feed and your postings on your Instagram page, it strikes me is there's parallels to the work that I'm doing with Street View Vagabond, where these are kind of like snapshots of small towns, may or may not be on the beaten path, so to speak,
right?
And for all intents and purposes, kind of like daily life. And it strikes me as interesting as you're talking about the evolution of postcards. Looking at these two right here, the one from 1912. So this is the old stone church there in Schuler Lake, New York. From our modern sensibilities, it's kind of a really bad photograph, right? It's like the trees are covering the church. You don't even see the steeple, and it's. But and the other one is probably a little bit more traditional from a tourist standpoint. We've got some action and some activity in the park and that sort of thing too. But have you learned anything about like postcard productions? Are these promotional? Is this like are these actual photographs that people are taking and just turning into postcards? Like, what have you learned about the actual production?
It happened a lot of different ways. I was just doing some research on a company with a rather generic name. It was the Art Manufacturing Company. It was originally in a town called Amelia, Ohio, and then they eventually moved to Zanesville, Ohio. And I found this postcard, and it had this very interesting church on it. And I thought, oh, well, what was this? And I flipped it over, and it basically says, we can produce postcards like this for you, okay? And it was an ad from the Art Manufacturing Company. And I don't know how they decided who they would send it to, but they were in Ohio. They sent this particular one to West Virginia. It made its way back to me, who knows? But they actually had a little breakdown of, if you want 250 postcards, we will charge you this much. I think 1,000 postcards. This was right around 1910. 1,000 postcards was $7.50. So you do the math, you could sell them in the store for 2.5 cents, and the storekeeper could make $12.50 on selling off these postcards. So some instances, it was in their model, they would, request people send us a photograph, we'll make you postcards of your town. And in other instances, there were companies that would actually travel and shoot photography of towns. And you see some very interesting things there, because a lot of the early postcards were hand colored, right? So there was not color photography, right? There was color printing. So what would happen is the company would go into a town, shoot a photo, which is black and white, and then somebody back at the factory who had never been there, who had never seen it, would color the photo, okay, or color the postcard. And I did one on this wonderful looking fountain, and the postcard shows it as this magnificent bronze fountain sitting on a stone base. And when I was trying to find that fountain in modern day, I was looking and I was all confused, and I finally realized the fountain itself was actually carved out of marble. And even today, it's this very pleasing white marble fountain. But if you look at the postcard, you would have assumed it was bronze, because the company and the printer had never actually been there before. So there's all these different dynamics of kind of place and separation of place for the creation of these cards.
Yeah, it's interesting. So these would be examples of hand-colored.
Yeah, and both of those have some great stories. The one at the top was written by a lady at the time that she wrote the postcard. She was nearing the end of her life, and this very subtle message she throws in the statement, "I shall never go to Rockdale again." And the reality is she's coming to grips with the fact that she's old and she can't travel the way that she wants to, and she's never going to go to that little town again where her friend is, and she was writing that postcard to her friend. And then the one on the bottom, that's one of those interesting examples of how much things have changed. If you look at that street corner today, it doesn't necessarily have that regal feel that it did in the postcard. The arch is gone, kind of the stone pillars around the edge of the park is gone, and really that monument, it's a monument to Civil War soldiers, is the only kind of thing left on that corner tucked back in the park that you would look at and say, that's that same corner, right? Even the little bits of buildings and stuff are different. So, a lot of times it's finding that one thing in the postcard view and being able to connect it to the now view that says, oh, I'm in the right place.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of loss on this page, right? I shall never go back again.
It's interesting. There's a lot of emotion in these old cards.
Yeah. Have you ever had that moment where you just like, it's so like takes your breath away, or it just hits you hard? happens a lot. I actually I live in kind of Northeast Ohio, and I go to estate sales on the weekends and dig through the old boxes and look for postcards. And I went to this one in this little town called Ravenna, Ohio, and the person happened to be a stamp collector, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of stamps. So as I was digging through there, I would find a postcard here and a postcard there, and I put together a stack, and wasn't even really looking at them that much. And put together a stack of postcards, went up to the lady up front, and I said, "How much?" And she goes, "Does $2 sound fair?" And I said, "That's great." So I took the stack of postcards home and was going through them, and I found this one, and it was sent to a man by the name of Avalon Robertson in 1904, and it was dressed to the Culbera cut, Panama, okay? And somewhere back in the old mental database, it kicked in, I thought, that's about the same time we started digging the Panama Canal, okay? And I was actually able to find a government record of the employee roster, and this was 1904. This young gentleman had graduated from a high school in Boston just 2 years earlier. He was 20 years old. So at the age of 20, he left Boston, went down to Panama, and helped dig the Panama Canal. And that particular area where he was
It was called, there was essentially the spine of Panama. So they literally dug a valley through this mountain range as the central part of the Panama Canal. And he was a surveyor. So he was down in the bottom with the transit, figuring out how deep they had to dig and the width and all that. And then somehow between 1904 and 2 months ago, that postcard made its way to the bottom of a cardboard box in Ravenna, Ohio. So it is literally an 8,000-mile postcard. And that was one of those ones. And then I was also able to find what happened to him later in life and when he passed away. And you talk about postcards that just give you a wow moment. It was just how that postcard made an 8,000-mile journey, how I happened to find it, how he was such an interesting place in history. And then I think he passed away in the 60s, and he had a family who thought highly of him. And I thought, wow, there's just so many interesting angles to that. And that's probably one of the favorite ones I've ever held and owned in my hands.
Well, it's significant. It's that crossroads of personal history and world history. And,
Oh, absolutely.
and again, there's that story of how you got the postcard, and even
Yeah.
that mystery of like, why is this in a box in Ohio, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. And I think what I'm hearing from you and the stories that you're writing, you're really digging into like the fascinating stories of each person.
Yep.
And one of the things that I like about your project too is I'm pulling up some other postcards here of these, in my mind's eye, are pretty nondescript places, right? Meadville, Pennsylvania, Minnesota City, Minnesota. Personally, I've never heard of them. Maybe over 100 years ago, they might have been better known. They're not necessarily major destinations today. Not sure if they were major destinations back then. But also just that, you've got this element of like everybody has a story and everybody can be fascinating. And I feel, and I wonder if you weigh on this too, is like, do you feel that sense of place? Is there fascination with places too? That almost like every place can also be fascinating as well.
Yeah, and these are great examples of that. So this one on the top, it's that area right along that lake has literally been an amusement park for over 100 years, right?
Oh, wow.
And it started as what they considered an exposition park, where they would do things like horse shows and they would do livestock shows, right? And then they built a ballroom so they could have dances, and then the ballroom was followed by a carousel, and then there was a roller coaster, right? And it was kind of one of those smaller parks, not the mega parks that we have today. And it kind of bounced along in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, going in and out of business. And at one point, the roller coaster burned down, right? And just within the past couple of years, there's been an effort to bring it back. So, and amusement parks are just endlessly fascinating for the people who've tried to make them go over the years, right? So, you've got these regal looking people in their gowns and their suits and their straw hats, getting off the boat to go to Exposition Park, and follow that forward through the next 100 years of people in shorts and t-shirts, riding a roller coaster, and
so wait, this is interesting. So this is from the viewpoint of the rides are behind me.
Yeah, the rides are behind me, and you're overlooking the lake as people get off the little steamship that drop them off at the park.
So again, that's an interesting example of like taking a photo of not where the action is.
Yeah.
It feels like, that's what struck me. I'm a very visual person, which is why I love Instagram and the visual medium there. And I'm looking at these photos, and you telling me that story is awesome, because it's like, oh, this is a really fascinating place.
Yeah, and then the one
photo of a roller coaster.
Yeah, and there are, and then the one down below it, it's kind of a story and a journey in and of itself. There was a family that emigrated to the United States. A number of them settled in Ohio, and then one particular member of the family started working their way west. And this is interesting because the photo is actually an old hotel that was on the lakefront in Chicago. And then the postcard itself was actually sent from Minnesota. So this person picked this postcard up along the way in their travels, kept it, never used it, and they're actually referring to their mother-in-law who passed away, and they were sending word back to the rest of the family in Ohio that the death was peaceful when the mother-in-law passed away. So you've got this great family story, you've got this travel story. The hotel itself no longer exists. At one point, it was literally lakefront in Chicago, and then when they reworked the shoreline, it actually got moved back in. So at one point, you would literally walk off your little porch there at the hotel and step onto the beaches of Lake Michigan, and now that location is now 100 yards from the water. Oh, wow. So this is one that just has all kind of little ripples to it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The change, and I think that reminds me of the fact that, like, I have postcards in a drawer over here, just because you pick up postcards when you travel, and like, I didn't get around to sending them, but I have them, and then I could send it now. That sounds like that, I got to send word that mother-in-law has died, and just grab a random postcard.
Yeah, grab what you had. Yeah. And I'll find postcards that are blank and were never used. I'll also find postcards that were put in envelopes and mailed with other postcards. So there'll be one postcard that says, hey, I'm sending you a bunch of postcards, right? So none of them actually have a postmark or a stamp on it. And then I also find postcards that were written but never addressed. So there's all kind of levels of, whether the postcard was used or not used, or whether they ever got around to sending it.
Yeah, that kind of untold story / untold or unmade connection, I should say. Going back, I'm putting up 4 more photos here. I just grabbed them randomly from your feed. Again, congratulations, coming up on 400 posts. So this is yet another 4 posts that you put up over the life of your project. And these strike me as, again, this like mundaneness, these buildings. Although, the Cincinnati Union Terminal is quite beautiful and is iconic, and Our Lady of Victory, there is a sense of majesty to these, and like, hey, I want to share this and send this out. So, and postcards as a way of travel. One question I have here is in terms of as I was talking about last time, or the last slide, is like, I find that if you dig enough, like everywhere and every person can be fascinating. You're willing to ask those questions, right? And so there's almost a sense of kind of like, these are like mundane postcards. Like, why would you send a photo of the Clinton Coliseum? But the flip side of that is, the curiosity of the story behind it and why it's significant, and all of that wrapped up in there too. So I'm coming to it from the standpoint of like the mundaneness of Street View, right? You're literally dropping into the middle of a place where people are taking their garbage out, right? And there's a sense of like, that's, why would you spend time like engaged in that? And I feel that affinity to your project, where it's like, but that's really interesting, right? I want to talk to that person taking their garbage out. I want to understand, like, what is it like to live on this corner? So this is all centered in the Midrust, right? And I love that name. So congrats on that. What have you learned about life in the Midrust during this era that you're kind of bookending all of this work in?
I think probably the biggest surprise, and I guess really the scope and the scale of how ambitious people were, whether they were individuals or whether they were businessmen, and what they managed to accomplish, and just the sense of pride that they had in these places and towns, and really just the purpose that they lived their lives with, and what they were able to accomplish. And this, this little set of cards is just a great example. The one in the upper left, the black and white one, it was written to a gentleman by his daughter, who was only 17 or 18. And at that very young age, she moved away from home. And, back then it was not only to go and live their own life, but also at that point, you did not want to be a burden on your family anymore. So you struck out on your own. So this one is actually a hotel. And she basically says, this is where I'm working. This is where I put in my hours, right? So in her own little way, that was her striking out into the world. And then the one in Clinton, Iowa, kind of the great bit of irony there is when this building was built, there were literally posters of it that said absolutely fireproof. And then about a year after this postcard was sent, it burned down in a fire. There was a dance. It was like a holiday dance, I think on a December 23rd. And the last people left the building at 2:30 in the morning. And by 4 o'clock the next morning, somebody spotted flames coming out of the roof. And the whole building was gone. If you go to that street corner there, it's not gone. It's not there anymore. If you look at the church, that was really the passion of a gentleman. He was born in the 1840s. When the Civil War came, he went and was a soldier for the Union and was involved in defending a number of bridges and some water supplies. He went home, helped with the family grocery business, got to be a very astute business person. And then when he was in his late 30s, he decided that he wanted something different and he was going to become a priest. So he became a priest. He took over a struggling orphanage, started a hospital, and there was a church on this very spot. It burned down. And he said, we're not just going to build a regular church. We're going to build a cathedral. And his name was Father Nelson, and he's responsible for the funding that built that. And when that structure was built, there was zero loans. He raised all the money. They paid for that building in cash. And then, you mentioned the Cincinnati Terminal. That's one of those incredible Art Deco buildings you look at. And, that's one of those postcards you look at and you go, is that place even real? Right. It just looks so fantastic, right? It's almost like a fantasy piece. And then sure enough, you go look at it and it's a building with its own history. So, like you said, they seem simple, but when you start to peel back the layers a little bit, each one of them's got a story.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually went to high school in Dayton, Ohio. And so there was, I've been to this, I think right now the Union Terminal is it's a museum. It's like
it's a museum.
Science museum or natural history. Yeah. But yeah, beautiful building. So, you're talking about we got the story as it intersects with the person and the place. And even there's variety, right? The individuals that are, for example, the Union Terminal, like my experience at the Union Terminal is very different than this person that's just writing and saying, hey, I arrived at 8 this morning, right? They're coming in on the train. And so, everybody's fascinating and every place is fascinating. Then it must be just fun, right? You're just picking the postcards and just like, hey, it's almost like, a little bit of a present, and you start to unwrap that.
Oh, absolutely. And you never know where it's going to go as you start looking.
What do you really enjoy about this project?
I think it's the surprise element. It's kind of that connection of the dots, that aha moment when you kind of figure out, what is the story. I just wrote one that'll be coming out. It was about, there was an old concrete football stadium in Akron, Ohio called the Rubber Bowl, right? The Rubber Bowl, right? So like the Orange Bowl, the Cotton Bowl, well, Akron had the Rubber Bowl, right?
Okay, cool.
And the postcard was actually
tires. Do they produce tires though?
No, it was just a football. Well, Akron produced tons and tons of tires.
Yeah,
it was the tire capital of the world, and that's why they named the Rubber Bowl the Rubber Bowl, right?
Okay, all right, that makes sense. Cool.
So I started writing the story and digging into the story. And it was sent to a gentleman who was a World War II veteran. And so I was looking at the date of the postcard and then, the dates of his life. And I thought that this postcard was going to be a World War II story. And the person who sent him the postcard one of the lines in the middle says, "It sure is cool here." And I thought, oh, that's kind of a fun little thing. So I started looking, and then in the course of doing the research, I found that the Rubber Bowl had been the site of some amazing concerts, right? So ironically, my wife and I had actually seen Aretha Franklin and Ringo Starr do a concert at the Rubber Bowl, right?
Together?
So I started going through all the different people who actually performed there. And back in 1972, one music promoter rented out the venue for the entire summer. And in that summer, they had everybody from Three Dog Night and Stevie Wonder to the Rolling Stones. So the Rolling Stones did this concert in the Rubber Bowl in Akron, Ohio. And when you look at the picture, there is not a spot to cram in another human being, right? And so what I thought was going to be this World War II story, all kind of centered around this idea of it sure is cool here, right? And so I did it on the cool factor of all these different concerts that was held there. And then I actually went back and I was able to check the weather records. And although it was August when he sent the postcard, the morning he sent the postcard, it was only 48 degrees. So I'm sure when he said it sure is cool here, he was talking about the weather, not all the great concerts, but that's kind of how I strung it all together. So where I thought I was going and where it wound up was a completely different thing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that's that piece there, right? And that's the thing too, is like we're all walking stories of all these different accumulations of our life stories. And I had that experience in talking to my family and the older generations of my family and doing family histories with them. And it's fascinating because like, oh, I didn't realize you did X, Y, and Z. And even that is a great story where it's like, if you're just driving through Akron and you come across, is the Rubber Bowl still visible today?
That's the other cool part of the story. It was built into a hillside where one side of the football field was up against the hillside and the other side was freestanding kind of bleachers made out of concrete, but it was its own freestanding structure. And starting in 2018, they started to demolish it. And the Rubber Bowl is actually one of those venues that often shows up on kind of the abandoned places type of websites, because you still see, the sign with the Rubber Bowl, but there's trees growing up and around it. Well, in 2018, they started to demolish the stadium, and then they came to the conclusion that the one set that's built, stands that's built into the hill, is actually supporting the roadway behind it. So the demolition was actually stopped halfway through. So when you see it, you can see kind of the remnants of what once was, but it's no longer this, glorious horseshoe with the football field in the middle.
Well, right. And like driving by there, you'd be like, oh, what is that? Little do you know that like Stevie Wonder and the Rolling Stones were, doing a whole packed crowd there back in the day.
And then you can chase it. Bob Hope gave a presentation there during World War II to honor people who had died in the war. Carl Wallinda, the tightrope walker, at one point they stretched a cable across the top of the stadium and Carl Wallinda walked across the top of the stadium. Billy Graham did a revival there for an audience of 40,000 people. So, I mean, it's just endless.
Wow, that's fascinating. These are all postcards. And so, I'm fascinated by travel, and that's why I do Street View Vagabond also. It's picking a different place around the world, dropping down there, what is going on here, what is life there. I love to travel. What have you also learned about travel during this era, and has it changed much to today?
Yeah, I think there's some things that are different, some things that are the same. Certainly the means by which they do it are different. It was train, it was boat, it was wagon, it was riverboat. Rivers, I think, have really changed from a travel standpoint. They were, for a long time, the highways of the country. So when people traveled, a lot of times it was traveling by river. And then that was kind of supplanted by the railroads. And, those don't have, kind of the usage that they did in the past. There's certainly some commuter elements to the trains, but it's not necessarily that great adventure of going from point A to point B. It's almost recreational now for these long train rides as opposed to necessities. So, what they did was a little bit different and how they traveled. And postcards are somewhat interesting, kind of like the Minnesota one that we saw earlier. I do find a lot of postcards where it was picked up in one location and then mailed from another location. And a lot of times, if you look at the satellite maps and find those two places, there's a rail line that connected those two, right? And, in one of the interesting conventions, people would often write in the inscription, like Friday afternoon, July 7th, right? And then the postcard would be postmarked by the post office. And sometimes they wrote it on the same day and sent it on the same day. And other times there's that difference, right? And that's one of those interesting little things that you see where the postcards from one place, it was picked up somewhere else and postmarked in another place, right? So people were definitely mobile. They were out there traveling. And although I focus on postcards kind of sent showing these areas, I also have a lot of postcards that were sent to these areas. And I just had a fascinating collection that were sent from Panama back to Ohio, Uruguay back to Ohio, California to Ohio, the Grand Coulee Dam back to Pennsylvania, right? So, and you see people saying, hi, mom, hi, dad, dearest sister, right? So you can tell that these are people who they're out traveling and having an adventure, and they're reconnecting with the people back in this part of the country. So, sometimes, and that's I think one of those stereotypical things that people think is that, hey, these small town people, they were born in the same small town, they died in the small town, and they never left that small town. And that's just really not the case. I mean, there was that same sense of adventure and spirit, and whether it was going out and traveling for the purposes of seeing the world or, pursuing a job or something else, they were out traveling.
Are there any places in the Midrust footprint that were like tourist destinations that surprised you?
Oh, there's all kind. There was a place up in Michigan where the gentleman was actually a traveling salesman, and this is in the 30s and the 40s, and he had traveled all around, and he decided that he was going to make his own roadside attraction. So he built his own giant cave complex out of concrete into this hillside in Michigan, and then he created all these little vignettes of taxidermied animals within there, right? And that was a cool place to go, right? There was a place in central Pennsylvania where this guy built this giant miniature town inside this building. So you could go through the town and then go into this building and then look at the town. And then there was this great restaurant next door, which was one of these family style restaurants. So, a lot of times
near Reading, I think.
It was, back
just closed recently, I think.
Right. Yeah. So just back before the interstates took over, people traveled all these small 2-lane roads and went through these small towns, and there was places to stop and eat and stay, right? And you just, you didn't hop on the highway and just blow through big chunks of America in 4 hours. So there was, the pace was slower, but you saw these interesting things, and whether it was, lakes or rock outcroppings, other natural features, these man-made roadside attractions, there was a lot of it around. There was places where they built an entire motel to look like Indian teepees. It was called Wigwam Village. So you could stay overnight in a wigwam. And I think there was 3 or 4 of those across the country, and 1 or 2 of them are still left. So yeah, those things are all out there. And sometimes you can see bits and pieces of them. I found a Stuckey's restaurant on a little 2-lane road in Indiana, and completely overgrown. The sign was gone, but it still had a very distinctive roof line, and the concrete curbs where you pulled off the 2-lane road into the parking lot were still there. So, and that was one of those places where the postcard exists, right? Where people stop there to have a meal, and the building's still there, but not too much of it.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's like that example of the guy in Michigan with the caves. First of all, I'm sure that's probably is it still around or is it's totally
It
decayed?
is still there. It's no longer an operating
Okay,
tourist attraction.
okay. See, that sounds like something you see in Atlas Obscura or like
Yeah.
Roadside America kind of a thing. But that really gets down to kind of like that, the opposite of kind of what I've been highlighting here is the mundaneness of it. It's like, if we can create something that's completely unique, you draw people to come do it too.
Yep.
Um, and it sounds like those types of postcards are also existing out there, like the cave with taxidermied animals, or
Yeah.
I think it's like any town USA or big town USA or small town USA, the one in Pennsylvania with like
Yeah.
all of that kind of stuff too. So it's this fascination with the novel or getting out and doing something new.
Yeah, and
Travel
sometimes
wise.
these people were just entrepreneurs. They were businessmen. They wanted you to stop, and whether it was, a small town inside a building or a restaurant shaped like a teapot, they wanted that thing that was interesting, so you would stop and look at it. And the
Yeah,
teapot restaurant actually burned down. So I did have a postcard of that.
yeah. Yeah, there's been a few of those over across the country, or
Yeah.
coffee pots and that sort of thing too. Um, in that kind of vein, are there any that you just love the most, or like the most unique? That are those the most ones you've had, or are there any other ones that are pretty unique?
Well, it's interesting. So, I talked to a lot of postcard collectors, and the things that were popular, the Niagara Falls, right?
Mhm,
Lots of people went there, and there were lots of postcards of those places.
mhm,
But the smaller ones that are off the beaten path and a little bit more rare, the tiny town that had its own amusement park, right? Or the
mhm,
guy who built a miniature railroad,
mhm.
those weren't frequented by the same volume of people that Niagara Falls were.
Right,
So the number of postcards that were made and purchased and sent are a lot less, right? So they're actually, the postcard collectors are interested in those types of postcards based upon their rarity. I love them because the story is
right,
just so different, right? So I chase a
yeah,
lot of those down.
yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. It sounds like not a lot has changed, right? It's like there's all
Yeah,
those photos of the Eiffel Tower, right? But like
yeah.
you can get to the small town outside of Paris. There's a lot of interesting things happening there too.
Yeah, and it's, history's been tough on small towns. There's lots where you see these giant, 3-story red brick factories that went on for 100 yards, right?
Yeah.
And they, produced clothing, or they produced bicycles or washing machines.
Mhm.
And a lot of times in those small towns, those buildings are just gone. There was no way for the small town to actually support that, anymore. So it's interesting that the big cities with some of the more prominent buildings, those seem to stand the test of time. But in a lot of small towns, it's, and fires were tough
Yeah.
on small towns. I find postcards, and I go and try to see what the town looks like now, and it's sometimes gone. Not only just not recognizable, sometimes gone. And then you read, and you'll say, and you'll find that there was a fire in 1904, and then 1916, and then the last part of the town burned down in 1960, right? And
Mhm.
I found one in Iowa where you can see the sidewalk, and the sidewalk's still there going through an empty field, because the town that used to be there is gone. I found one in this little borough outside of Pittsburgh that had this very regal looking mansion sitting up on a hill. And down at the base of the hill, there was a stone wall. And kind of in the center of the stone wall, there was an opening where the set of stairs went up in terraces up the hillside of this mansion.
Mhm.
And now when you look at it, the mansion's gone, the hillside's just overgrown with trees, but that stone
Very
wall is
cool.
still there with that one set of stairs going to nowhere. So
Yeah.
a lot of things stay the same, but when you go through enough of them, you realize, wow, I really would have loved to have, walked in that town or see the inside of that building or theater or church, and they're just gone.
Yeah. And there's a story in those places, and that's what you're
Yeah.
trying to get to.
Yep.
Where do you see this going? This is really exciting. I'm stoked for you, and you got
So
400 posts.
yeah,
What's next?
I've seen varying statistics
Uh-huh,
of the number of postcards that were sent
uh-huh.
in the early 1900s, and it's literally in the millions.
Okay.
So there are no doubt lots and lots of stories to chase out there. There are some postcards that are puzzles. I have this little stack that I just haven't been able to crack yet.
Mhm.
And I got this one wonderful postcard, and it's a husband and a wife and a small boy who is probably about 2 or 3 years old. And it's sent from one side of Ohio to the other side. And the inscription says, "Whenever you're sad, think of us." And it's signed Carl, and I can't remember the other two names on it. And they sent it to the, and I have done everything in my power to look in that small town to try to find a husband and a wife and a child of about the same age. I cannot figure out who these people are, and it just bugs me. So those are some of the ones I'm just going to continue to try to track down and crack. There's also there was an era of what were called real picture postcards, and it was before the era of printing. And the postcards were actually very early rudimentary photographs. So they would photograph a town, and those are much more rare. They weren't produced in massive numbers, and the stories within those are just incredible as well. So I think there's a lot more opportunity of stories and companies and businesses and people who, on the surface you would say they led kind of a common life, but they had some really, really fascinating things happen to them or within their lives or within their time frame. So it's endless. And then I'm continuing to journey out into the world of historical fiction, kind of exploring some of the other stories that were out there inspired by these. So I'll be continuing to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. It's such a great project. I'm so stoked to be following you and watch you on your journey. And just as a reminder to everybody who's watching here, the Midrust Project, you can see Kenneth's postings on Instagram at Kenneth J. Weiss on the daily, right? You post every day?
Every day.
Every day. Okay. So again, congrats to the 400 and also your website. So, check it out, kennethjweiss.com. Learn more about this project, the short stories. You can get the PDFs, the downloads of the short stories, and check out all the other writings that you're doing there too. It's like you said, there's millions of postcards out there. There's millions of stories. And I really like what you said there too. It's those small roads that help you to travel slow. And this really feels like this is the slow travel of getting the sense of these stories and understanding what life was like. And it's fascinating. And
great.
Kudos to you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, it was a great conversation. Thanks so much. And best wishes on the continued success of the project.
All right. I'll be sending you a postcard.
Well, thanks for watching. If you found this video enjoyable, please like it and consider subscribing. My channel is all about traveling around the world using Google Street View. I post a short form YouTube short every weekday of the places that I'm exploring on Google Street View. And I also post long form interviews of folks that I'm having about their hometowns as I connect with people all around the world. So if you enjoy exploring the world, consider following me.